We got a call. You need to come with us for verification.
You need to leave. You have no warrant to be here.
I am recording this. Get your hands off him. That's assault.
Two ICE agents believed they held absolute authority. They possessed an address, an anonymous tip phoned in from a prepaid cell.
It was just past 6 a.m. when the pounding on the door broke the silence of that suburban home. Not ordinary knocking, the kind of pounding that does not ask permission, does not wait for an answer, that already communicates before a single word is spoken that whoever is on the other side did not come to talk. The man who walked to the door was still in his sleep clothes. He had not had coffee. He had not had time to process anything. And when he opened the door and found himself facing ICE agents in tactical vests carrying the energy of people who had arrived to execute an operation, the first thing he did was something none of them expected. He asked to see the warrant. There was no warrant. And what happened in the minutes that followed, inside that house, was recorded. The camera captured everything with a clarity that left no room for alternative versions, for misunderstandings, for defense narratives constructed after the fact. It was all there, agents entering without legal authorization, hands being placed on a man who had committed no crime, the verbal resistance of someone who knew his rights and refused to surrender them, even with federal agents standing inside his own living room. The video began circulating before the sun had even fully risen that morning. The man being physically grabbed by an ICE agent inside his own home was named Marcus. And Marcus was not an ordinary citizen without resources, without knowledge, without anyone to call. Marcus was a chief of police. He had spent decades in public safety, had built an entire career within the structures of the very system now being used against him, and knew the law with the intimacy of someone who applies it every day. The irony of that moment, a police chief being physically restrained by federal agents without a warrant inside his own home, was so brutal that the first people who saw the video thought it was staged. It was not. It was completely real, and what made that situation even more explosive was the sequence of events that followed in the hours, days, and weeks after that morning, because the agents who entered that house without a warrant, who put their hands on Marcus without legal justification, who ignored every protocol they themselves were required to follow, had failed to calculate one fundamental thing: that the person they were approaching knew exactly what they were doing wrong, knew exactly how to document it, and had precisely the contacts necessary to ensure that no one would forget. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. This story gets more intense with every section, and you are going to want to follow it all the way to the end. Before we continue, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, do you believe this could happen to anyone, or does it only happen to certain people? Tell me down below, because that question matters deeply to what this story is about to reveal. The video from that morning became one of the most watched and most discussed recordings in the debate about federal abuse of power in the United States during that period. Not because it was the only case of ICE agents entering homes without a warrant, but because this time the person on the other side of the operation had a name, had a title, had decades of documented public service, and had a camera recording every second. And because when everything was over, the careers that were destroyed did not belong to the man being grabbed. They belonged to the ones doing the grabbing. Marcus had arrived in that city nearly 20 years before. He came young, with a criminal justice degree in hand, and a quiet determination that the people around him took a little time to recognize, but that never disappeared. He had started at the bottom, like any other officer, working night shifts in difficult neighborhoods, learning in practice what no classroom can fully teach about what it means to stand between the law and chaos. He had risen slowly, without shortcuts, accumulating respect in the way that can only be built through time and consistency. And when he was appointed chief of police, it had been unanimously the kind of decision that happens when no one in the room has a legitimate argument against it. The house where Marcus lived was the house he and his wife had bought 16 years earlier, when the neighborhood was still developing and the lots were more affordable. They had renovated slowly over the years, one room at a time, the way middle-class families build. Their space is when there is no money to spare, but there is enough patience. It was an ordinary house, American suburb, with a lawn in the front and a 2-car garage. The kind of house that draws no attention, that blends in with the others on the street, that exists simply as the place where a family sleeps, eats, and begins and ends its days. There was nothing in that house that justified what happened that morning. ICE had received a tip. That was the official starting point of the entire operation. An anonymous report alleging that an undocumented individual was residing at that address. This kind of tip arrives by the thousands every month to immigration agencies, and the vast majority of them are investigated with some level of due diligence before any action is taken. There is a protocol. There is a verification chain. There is, above all, the constitutional requirement that federal agents obtain a judicial warrant before entering a private residence, unless there is an immediate and documentable emergency justifying warrantless entry. None of that was followed that morning. What the agents who arrived at that house at 6 in the morning did not know, or did not bother to verify, was the identity of the resident. A basic search in the system, the kind of check that takes literally minutes, would have immediately revealed that the address was registered in Marcus's name, that Marcus was an American citizen born in that state, and that Marcus held the highest position in the city's police hierarchy. That verification was either not done, or it was done and ignored, and neither possibility is less serious than the other. Because if it was not done, it reveals an operational negligence that puts any citizen at risk who has the misfortune of being targeted by an anonymous tip. And if it was done and ignored, the problem is far more serious than negligence. The team that knocked on that door consisted of 4 agents, all uniformed, all in tactical vests with the ICE acronym in yellow letters on the back, all carrying the posture of people who had been briefed for a containment operation and not for a verification visit. When Marcus opened the door and asked to see the warrant, the response he received was not a legal explanation. It was pressure. The agents pushed forward, and when Marcus did not step back, when he held his ground at his own threshold and kept demanding legal documentation, one of the agents put his hands on him and attempted to push him further inside the house. That was the moment the camera captured most clearly. That was the moment that destroyed careers. What the agents did not know, as that entire scene unfolded in Marcus's living room, was that the person recording was not just a frightened family member trying to document an abuse out of instinct. It was Marcus's wife, a woman who had been married to a police chief for nearly 2 decades and who knew, with a precision that came from years of living alongside security, protocols, exactly what needed to be captured in that video for it to be useful afterward. She kept the camera steady. She made sure the agents' faces were visible. She made sure the interior of the house was visible, proving that the entry had occurred without authorization inside a private residence. Every second of that recording was, without the agents realizing it, evidence being built against them. The video lasted just under 4 minutes. 4 minutes that contained enough to end careers, open federal investigations, and put the name of that operation in the headlines of news outlets that the agents involved had probably never imagined would be covering a case like theirs. Marcus had been released that same morning after one of the agents finally ran the check that should have been done before anyone knocked on that door and discovered, with an embarrassing swiftness, exactly who the man was that they had just grabbed inside his own home. The operation was closed without any arrest, without any evidence of immigration irregularity, and with 4 federal agents walking out of that house in silence, knowing they had made a mistake whose dimensions were still becoming clear. Marcus did not spend the rest of that morning trying to emotionally recover from what had happened, though anyone in his position would have had every right to do so. He spent that morning on the phone. He called his personal attorney first, then the legal counsel of the police department, then 2 contacts he had built over decades of work in public safety who had direct access to federal oversight bodies. Each call was made with the same methodical calm Marcus had developed over years of handling crises. He was not panicking. He was building, brick by brick, the structure of a response that went far beyond a formal complaint. The video was sent to the attorney that same morning, accompanied by a written document prepared by Marcus's wife, detailing the exact sequence of events from the first sound of the pounding on the door to the moment the agents left. She had noted the times, had described each agent's appearance with enough detail for identification, had recorded every word she had heard clearly enough to be quoted. The document was 6 pages long. It was the kind of account that attorneys spend years trying to obtain from clients and rarely receive with that level of precision and detail. Marcus's wife had produced it in under 2 hours, while the memory of the agents was still fresh and her hands were still slightly trembling. When the attorney watched the video for the first time, he did something experienced lawyers rarely do right away. He said, without hesitation, that it was one of the clearest cases of Fourth Amendment violation he had seen in years of practice. The Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution protects citizens against unreasonable searches and seizures, and requires that government agents obtain a warrant based on probable cause before entering a private residence. There was no warrant. There was no documented probable cause. There was none of the emergency conditions that the law recognizes as justification for entry without judicial authorization. There were only 4 federal agents who had decided, for reasons they would have to explain under oath, that the rules did not apply that morning. The question Marcus's attorney began investigating immediately was not just what had happened, but why it had happened. The anonymous tip was the official starting point, but anonymous tips arrive every day and do not result in tactical pre-dawn operations without prior identity verification. Something had failed in the chain of command that authorized that operation, and identifying exactly where that failure had occurred was fundamental to determining the scope of legal responsibility. Because in cases like this one, responsibility rarely ends with the agents who knocked on the door. It travels up the hierarchy until it reaches whoever approved the operation, without ensuring that minimum protocols had been followed. The video leaked to the press before any official investigation was announced. It remains unclear exactly how that happened, whether it was a strategic decision by Marcus's legal team, whether it was someone within the oversight structures who felt the public had a right to know, or whether it was simply the inevitable result of a video of that impact existing on multiple devices simultaneously. What is clear is the effect the leak produced. In less than 24 hours, those images of an ICE agent with his hands on a black chief of police inside his own living room had been seen by millions of people, and the reaction was not one of disbelief. It was one of recognition. The quiet, heavy kind of recognition that comes when something you already knew was happening is confirmed on screen with unusual clarity. The official investigation was announced 48 hours after the video leaked. It was not a voluntary decision by the agency. It was a response to pressure, the kind of institutional movement that happens when silence starts costing more than transparency. The ICE Internal Oversight Office released a brief statement confirming it was aware of the incident and that a review of operational procedures was being conducted. The statement did not mention Marcus by name. It acknowledged no error. It contained no word of apology or recognition of what had been done. It was the kind of institutional communiqué designed to look like a response without actually being one, the kind that experienced attorneys read in 30 seconds and immediately understand means the battle will be long. Marcus's legal team had anticipated exactly that response. They had already prepared the filing of a federal lawsuit even before the official statement was released, working in the hours following the video. Leak with a speed that is only possible when you have absolute clarity about the strength of what is in your hands. The lawsuit was officially filed in federal court 3 days after the incident, naming all 4 agents individually, the supervisor who had authorized the operation, and the agency itself as an institution responsible for the systemic failure that had made that morning possible. It was a dense document, technically precise, and constructed in a way that closed each of the exits the defense typically uses to create doubt in cases of federal misconduct. What made this lawsuit particularly difficult to defend from the agency's standpoint was the combination of elements that rarely appear together in a single case. There was the video, which was irrefutable. There was Marcus's impeccable record, which eliminated any attempt to construct an alternative narrative about who he was or what he had done to deserve that approach. There was the complete absence of a warrant, which transformed the agent's entry into a clear and documented constitutional violation. And there was the fact that the anonymous tip that had started everything had never been verified by any means before the operation was authorized, which meant that protocol had been ignored, not by a single agent acting on his own, but by an entire chain of decisions that would need to be explained. The 4 agents were removed from operational duties during the investigation. That removal was officially presented as a standard administrative measure, the kind of thing that happens automatically while facts are being established. But everyone who understands how these structures work knew that suspension during a federal investigation, in cases with video evidence, rarely ends with a return to service. The agents hired private attorneys, separate from the lawyer the agency had designated to represent institutional interests, which was itself a clear signal that they understood their interests, and the agencies were not necessarily the same. Each began constructing their own version of events, and the versions were not consistent with each other. The supervisor who had authorized the operation was a man named Reeves, with 15 years of service and a record that, when it began to be scrutinized by the investigation, revealed a pattern that no one inside the agency claimed not to have seen before, but that no one had ever formally documented. There were other operations authorized by Reeves with insufficient identity verification. There were other residential entries with questionable warrant documentation. There were filed complaints that had never been seriously investigated, the kind of history that exists in silence within institutions until a case large enough forces everyone to look at it. Marcus's case was large enough, and Reeves's record was now being examined by investigators who had no interest in protecting him. Public pressure kept growing while all of this was happening behind the scenes. Civil rights organizations had formally entered the case as interested parties. Legislators from both parties had made public statements demanding explanations, which in a political climate normally divided on immigration issues was itself revealing about how indefensible that specific operation had been. It was not possible to frame what had happened as a matter of immigration policy because what had happened had nothing to do with immigration. It had to do with 4 federal agents entering an American citizen's home without a warrant, placing their hands on him without legal justification, and only backing down when they discovered who he was. That was the case. And that case had no political side. It had only one legal side, and that side was completely clear. The depositions began 6 weeks after the federal lawsuit was filed. This is the moment in a legal battle where the narratives constructed by defense attorneys meet the reality of questions asked under oath, and where the distance between what was said publicly and what actually happened frequently begins to collapse in ways that no communication strategy can contain. The 4 agents were deposed separately, in a deliberate sequence that Marcus's team had planned carefully, beginning with the agent who had placed his hands on him and progressing through the chain of command until reaching Reeves. Each deposition created a record that the next one needed to be consistent with, and consistency was exactly what that chain of command could not produce. The first agent to be deposed spent 3 hours answering questions about the events of that morning. His initial version was the rehearsed one, that the operation had followed protocol, that entry into the residence had been voluntary on the part of the resident, and that the force used had been minimal and justified by the resistance encountered. Each of those points was then confronted with the video, frame by frame, second by second. Marcus's attorney had prepared a detailed technical analysis of every moment in the recording, with precise timestamps and objective descriptions of what was happening in each frame. When the agent's version and what the video showed diverged, which happened repeatedly, the attorney simply stopped, pointed to the specific timestamp, and let the silence do the work. The second agent contradicted the first on 3 fundamental points. Not dramatically, not in a way that seemed intentional, but in the way contradictions emerge when 2 people are trying to recall a version of events that does not correspond to what actually happened. Small differences in sequence, discrepancies about who had made which decision and at what moment, incompatible versions of what had been said before entry into the residence. Each contradiction was documented by Marcus's attorneys with the quiet precision of people who knew they were building something that would be very difficult to dismantle later. The third and fourth agents deepened the contradictions rather than resolving them. Reeves was the last to be deposed. He arrived with 2 attorneys, one designated by the agency and one he had hired privately at his own expense, which communicated before any word was spoken that he understood the gravity of his position. His answers were carefully calibrated, the kind of testimony that is clearly the product of many hours of preparation with experienced lawyers. He acknowledged that he had authorized the operation. He stated that he had relied on the information provided by the team that had received the tip. He denied having known that the identity verification protocols had not been followed, and when confronted with the history of other operations with questionable documentation, he responded that each case had been handled according to the information available at the time, a phrase designed to sound reasonable while admitting nothing. What Reeves had not calculated was the volume of internal documentation that Marcus's team had obtained through formal public records requests, internal emails, operational reports, communication records between the agents and the supervisor in the hours before the operation. This material had been requested through the legal mechanisms available in this type of proceeding, and the agency had attempted to block part of the access by citing operational security concerns. The judge overseeing the case had rejected most of the blocks, determining that procedural transparency prevailed over institutional objections when there was prima facie evidence of constitutional rights violations. The material that reached Marcus's attorneys contained enough to transform what was already a solid case into something the agency simply could not. Defend in a public trial, settlement negotiations began discreetly, through indirect channels before the depositions were even fully completed. This is always the signal that the party being sued recognizes, at some level, its attorneys are not yet authorized to admit publicly that a trial would be worse than any agreement that could be negotiated now. The agency had an interest in avoiding a trial for reasons that went far beyond Marcus's specific case. A public trial with that video as the central evidence, with the contradictions between the agent's testimonies exposed before a jury, with Reeves's history being presented in detail, would create a precedent and a public record that would affect the agency far beyond that one case. Marcus knew this. His attorneys knew this. And they had no interest in facilitating an exit that did not fully reflect what had been done. The agreement was announced on a Thursday morning, 4.5 months after that 6 o'clock operation that had started everything. The figures were substantial, the kind of amount that federal agencies rarely agree to pay without a very clear awareness that the alternative would be worse. But Marcus had made it clear from the beginning, through his attorneys and at every moment of the negotiations, that money was not the center of what he was seeking. He had spent decades building a career dedicated to the idea that the law applies equally to everyone, that no one is above the protocols that exist to protect citizens from abuses of power, and that accountability is not optional when there is sufficient evidence that something wrong was done. He was not willing to accept an agreement that did not reflect that idea in a concrete and permanent way. The non-financial conditions of the agreement were, in many respects, more significant than the amount paid. The 4 agents involved in the operation were dismissed from the agency with no possibility of rehire in any federal law enforcement capacity. Reeves lost not only his job, but the certification he had accumulated over 15 years, which in practice ended any possibility of continuing a career in public safety at any level. The agency was required to implement a revised identity verification protocol before any residential operation, with multiple levels of confirmation that needed to be documented before any authorization could be granted. And Marcus's case was formally incorporated into the mandatory training material for new agents, not as an abstract example of what not to do, but as a specific case with names, faces, and real consequences. Marcus held a press conference the day after the agreement was announced. He appeared in uniform, which was a deliberate and meaningful choice. He was there not only as the victim of that specific incident, but as the chief of police of that city, representing an institution that had as much interest as any citizen in ensuring that federal agents operated within the boundaries of the law. He spoke for just over 10 minutes, without notes, without a teleprompter, with the direct clarity of someone who had thought deeply about what he wanted to say and had arrived at the essential. He said the agreement was not a personal victory. It was an obligation fulfilled. What Marcus said at that press conference about the video continued to be quoted in the weeks that followed in discussions about transparency and accountability in federal operations. He observed that the recording his wife had made that morning had not changed what had happened. The agents had still entered without a warrant. Hands had still been placed on him without legal justification. The abuse had still occurred. What the video had done was make it impossible to deny that it had occurred, and that distinction between what happens and what can be proven to have happened was the center of everything. Because without that recording, the agency's version would likely have prevailed, as it prevails in countless cases, where there is no camera, no witnesses with sufficient credibility, and no one with the resources necessary to sustain a legal battle against a federal agency. The dismissed agents disappeared from public view with a speed that contrasted with the impact the case had caused. There were no statements, no interviews, no public attempt to present an alternative side of the story. Their attorneys had clearly advised them that silence was the only reasonable strategy available, and they followed that advice. Reeves attempted, through the union representing federal agents, to reverse part of the conditions of his dismissal, arguing he had been treated disproportionately for a decision made in good faith with the information available. The argument did not survive the first levels of review. The information available had included a functioning camera near the neighboring community mailboxes, and a federal database with Marcus's name and title one click away. Good faith had a very clear limit there. What this case left as a permanent record goes beyond the careers ended and the settlement paid. It entered the legal literature on Fourth Amendment violations in immigration operations. It was cited in congressional hearings on federal agency oversight. It became one of the most referenced examples in discussions about what happens when power meets no informed resistance, when people who should know the law decide it does not apply to them in that specific moment, and when the only thing separating impunity from consequence is a camera in the right hands. Marcus returned to work. The department he led continued to function, and in that suburban home, where everything had begun at 6 in the morning on an ordinary day, life moved forward with the quiet awareness that things could have ended completely differently if any one of the elements of that specific equation had been different. That awareness, uncomfortable and necessary, is probably the most important thing this case produced.